On the evening of the 23rd of March, 1909, a man in Penzance wrapped 2 parcels, poured himself a whiskey, and lit a cigar. He gave one parcel to his son to post. He kept the other. Then he put on his coat, buttoned it to the chin, and walked out toward the sea. He was never seen alive again. It would be 6 months before anyone found him. And when they did, it wasn't a detective who found him. It was the gulls. His name was John Davidson, 51 years old. A Scottish poet, playwright, and novelist who, 20 years earlier, had been one of the most talked about writers in London. He'd grown up in Renfrewshire, the son of a minister, and worked briefly in a sugar refinery before turning to teaching and then to writing. By the 1890s, he'd found his voice, sharp, urban, unsentimental, and made his name with a poem about an underpaid London clerk that captured something raw about ordinary working life. For a few years, he ran with the same literary circles as W.B. Yeats. He would later be credited as a real influence on T.S. Eliot and on the Scottish poet Hugh MacDiarmid, but fame in the 1890s didn't last. His later books didn't sell. Money was a constant grinding problem. He suffered a breakdown in 1896. A literary fund grant helped for a while, and in 1906 he was awarded a small government pension with some financial help, it said, from George Bernard Shaw himself, but his health was failing too. He was increasingly convinced he was dying of cancer. By the end of 1908, broke, ill, and worn down by London, Davidson and his family relocated to Penzance on the Cornish coast. On paper, it looked like a retreat for his health. In his own letters, he called it something closer to exile. Davidson never settled in Penzance. He was polite to people, but distant. He didn't join the clubs or societies that a newcomer might have used to build a life in a small town. Aside from the library, he kept almost entirely to himself and to his writing, which remained, by every account, the only thing that still mattered to him. He resented being away from London's literary world. He believed, correctly or not, that his reputation there was fading without him. And there are small, strange details from this period that hint at just how dark his mood had become. Shortly after arriving in Penzance, he applied for a gun license, writing to a friend, half in black humour, that he wanted it to deal with the local cats and the local children. Around the same time, he used nitric acid on his own hand, apparently to remove a wart. It would later become one of the identifying marks listed on a police notice. He had, by his own past admission, thought about drowning himself before. Years earlier, he'd written, half joking or not, that if he ever hit rock bottom, the Thames would be waiting. Tuesday, the 23rd of March, 1909, was, by every account, an ordinary working day. Davidson spent it at his desk, pushing hard on what he intended to be his final major work. That evening he wrapped 2 parcels. He let his son Menzies carry one to the post office. He kept the other with him. He had a whiskey. He smoked a cigar, and among his papers, later, his family would find the manuscript for a book called Fleet Street Poems, with a note attached in his own hand, saying simply that this would be his last book. Then he left the house for what looked, to his family, like his usual evening walk along the seafront. He'd had pneumonia not long before, so he'd buttoned his coat all the way up, lapels to his chin, guarding his chest against the cold. He didn't come back. At first, nobody worried. Davidson often lost track of time on his coastal walks, and his wife and son assumed that was exactly what had happened again. It was only as the evening wore on that concern set in. His son Menzies and a neighbour went out looking, walking the promenade toward the fishing village of Mousehole. They found nothing. The next morning, Mrs. Davidson, reported her husband missing to the Penzance police. The response was limited. Officers searched the immediate seafront and harbour, working on the assumption that he'd simply slipped and gone into the water by accident. For a few days, the story caught fire nationally. London papers sent reporters down by motor car to Cornwall to chase the mystery of the vanished poet. But interest is a fragile thing. Within little more than a week, the journalists had packed up and gone home, the trail as cold as it had started. A local Cornish paper noted, not without some satisfaction, that the visiting press had gone back to London no wiser than when they'd arrived. Eventually, the family and what remained of the local investigation prepared a formal notice describing Davidson in case anyone had seen him: brown, piercing eyes, a varicose vein, a small scar on one finger where a wart had once been. That notice went out, and then nothing. No sighting, no trace, no body. For 6 months, John Davidson simply didn't exist anywhere. Not alive, not found. On Saturday the 18th of September, 1909, nearly half a year after he disappeared, 2 fishermen from Mousehole, Orlando Humphreys and James Harvey Lawson, noticed something odd near a stretch of coastal rock known locally as Black Carn. Gulls, circling, diving, settling. They went to look. One of the gulls was perched on a body, badly decomposed, dressed in a dark coat, lodged among the rocks of Mounts Bay, less than a mile from where Davidson had last been seen walking. It was him. The inquest that followed returned a verdict of accidental death. Officially, that was the end of it. A tragic fall, nothing more. But almost everyone who looked closely at the case, then and since, has read it differently. A man who had written openly, years before, about ending his own life in water. A man in declining health, convinced he was dying anyway. A note tucked into his final manuscript that reads less like an author's aside and more like a goodbye. Parcels wrapped and dispatched the same evening he vanished, as if he was tidying his affairs before leaving them behind for good. Whatever the coroner's verdict said, the far more haunting explanation was staring everyone in the face the whole time. On the 21st of September, 1909, in keeping with wishes he'd expressed while he was alive, John Davidson was buried at sea, 7 miles off the Penzance coast he'd grown to resent. There's one more strange detail worth knowing. In his will, Davidson left an instruction that almost nobody honours after death. He asked that no biography of him ever be written, and that none of his unfinished work ever be published. In a sense, he got exactly what he wanted: the full story of his last months in Penzance, what he was really thinking, what that second parcel contained, whether the walk to the water was an accident or a decision, vanished with him into Mounts Bay. All that's left is what the gulls found, and the sea he chose to disappear into.